Hello everyone, I'm Andy Sharp. So you thought my normal content was dull? Well, you've got a treat today. Today I'm talking about safety in leatherworking. It's not a topic that I've seen covered on YouTube before, but it's one that I think probably should be covered at some point by somebody, so I thought I'd step in and try and fill the niche. So I'm not a health and safety expert, and this won't be an exhaustive list at all. As a result, I'm not responsible for anything you do that may or may not get you killed as a result of this video, although you shouldn't be doing that because it's safety advice. So if it kills you, you're doing it wrong. So the first thing I'm going to cover is dust. Dust, you might think, oh, it's organic dust, from leather dust, it's from skin, therefore it can't be harmful. Well, no, that's not necessarily true. There are studies that have come out, I'll link them in the description below, all the studies I'm using by the way, that have linked leather dust exposure, particularly if you're working in a tannery or shoemaking factory or something like that, to an increase in your chance of developing COPD, so if you're not aware, that's chronic lung disease. And they also, quite concerningly, link it to a number of different cancers. They noticed back in the day that in Northampton, an area in England that's full of leather workers and tanneries and things like that, especially it was back in the day, that there was an unusually high prevalence of sinonasal cancer, so cancer of the nose and the sinuses, this kind of area. And they attributed this to leather dust, and other studies since have proven this link more conclusively. And while if you're a hobbyist, it might not necessarily be that you're being exposed to the quantities of dust required to give you a really high risk. It's still something that you definitely should be aware of. The risks largely were attributed to things like chromium in the tanning process of chrome-tanned leather, and arsenic and compounds like that. But if you're worried about it, or if you've got pre-existing lung conditions, it might not be a bad idea to wear a mask if you're doing something particularly dusty like sanding leather. And at least in our current pandemic climate, wearing a mask is cool now. So the second category we're going to cover is allergies. So it's actually possible to be allergic to a number of metals involved in leatherwork. So first off, the chrome that's used in chrome tanning leather. You can also be allergic to some of the hardware that's used. So if you're using solid brass hardware and you're allergic to that, it's likely the copper that you're allergic to. And if you're using plated hardware, something plated with nickel, that's a fairly common allergy. It's actually possible to be allergic to leather itself. There's a chemical used in the tanning process called DMF, or dimethyl fumarate, that people can often be allergic to. If you're worried about this, that is probably worth asking the individual tanneries whether they use this or not in their tanning process. And it's also a good idea to have a look at the backs of any chemicals you're using too. So if you're, for example, allergic to latex and you're using a latex-based adhesive, might not be a good idea to keep on using that adhesive. And I'm sure there are other chemicals that you know better than me whether you're allergic to, so it's worth having a look at the back of things you're using and checking that it's not going to kill you in any way. Another type of hazard is chemical toxicity. Unfortunately, some of the chemicals we use in leatherworking might not be as pleasant and skin safe and lung safe as we think they might be. And this is something to watch out for, particularly when you're using things like adhesives, dyes, edge paints, other chemicals like that. So for adhesives, they can contain things like toluene, heptane, other nasties that aren't very nice to inhale. Toluene in particular has been linked to reproductive issues. And although you can buy toluene-free contact cements, other solvents present might be pretty nasty, and it's worth reading the safety data sheet if you're concerned about this sort of thing. It's also worth checking out disposal, because if it's not good for you as a person, it's probably not good for the environment. So if you chuck it in a river and it kills all the fish, that's not an ideal circumstance. So probably better check the disposal for that. And it's not limited to adhesives. So the safety data sheet for Fiebing's dyes show that they've contained ethyl acetate, which isn't particularly nice stuff. I've also linked below the data sheet for Edge Coat, which also contains ethyl acetate. So it's just worth bearing in mind that these sort of what you think might be innocuous chemicals might not be. So if you're worried about this, it's a good idea to have a really well-ventilated space, although that's good practice with anything solvent-based, really. And if you're really worried, you can wear a mask. Make sure you don't get any of this in your eyes, and if it's going to come into contact with your skin, then it's probably a good idea to put gloves on, especially if you're dying, because not only is it not nice for your skin, but you also have orange hands afterwards, and you look a bit of a plum. So probably the most obvious dangers to leatherworkers are all the dangerous and sharp tools that we keep near us. So I've injured myself a few times, largely due to my own stupidity. I've put a leather needle in a vein in my wrist before by misusing a pair of pliers and a worktop and a needle. It's a long story. I've knackered that fingernail by hitting it with a big hammer, and miscellaneous cuts and bruises and things. A chap I know actually managed to drive a leather knife into his leg. He dropped it and was trying to catch it with his legs, but didn't notice that instead of the knife being like that, so you can catch it with your legs, it was sideways. So he pushed it into one of his legs. I'm not going to name any names, but I know he watches this channel. So to try and stop yourself getting too injured, don't be stupid like me. Don't misuse your tools. Use the right sized hammer for the job, for example, and not a massive hammer for a tiny target, because you might miss. Keep your knives nice and sharp, because the old saying, a dull knife is more dangerous than a sharp one, is true, because you don't know quite where it's going to go. Make sure your work area is free of any crap you can fall over. I know I'm particularly guilty of this. I have all sorts of bits lying around on the floor that I can trip over at a moment's notice. So perhaps don't do that. Make sure you don't cut towards your hands. I know that sounds really patronising, but I do it surprisingly often and I have to keep stopping myself from doing so. So just keep an eye on that. And also, to be honest, don't worry, because with a hobby that involves sharp knives, you will cut yourself at some point. Just try not to make it too often. Are you really a leather worker if you haven't stabbed yourself with an awl at some point? So, kind of leading on from the injury section is kind of musculoskeletal conditions. There's a lot of research out there that says that people who work in leather industries, textile industries, things like that, are at pretty high risk for things like neck, back and shoulder conditions. So make sure you've got like an ergonomic workstation, you're not spending hours sitting hunched over like that, because that's not probably going to do you any good. Make sure if you're working sitting down, you stand up fairly frequently, get your blood pumping around, everything like that. And if you're doing something particularly repetitive, be aware of kind of your risk of RSI and the measures that you can do in your specific task that might help stop that. So the last category I'm going to cover is actually one that I wasn't aware of until fairly recently, and that's noise. So the most common noise that I come across in my own leatherwork is the noise from peening rivets. So if I'm doing like copper or brass saddlery rivets in particular, they are surprisingly loud actually. I tried to get a decibel meter reading from this on the internet because I don't have my own decibel meter, and but the trouble is that things like this is so variable depending on how hard you hit it, the thing you're hammering onto and what that's sitting on, the material of the rivet, things like that. So it was loud enough that it was giving me a bit of ringing in my ears after I'd done a particular session. So I thought, well, that's probably a good idea to have to use ear protection as a result after that. There are things you can do to reduce the amount of noise you create. So if you're doing something with a hammer that can be done with a press, that obviously will be a less loud way of doing so. And also you can use things like softer hammers, putting pieces of leather in between the surfaces you're hammering, tying things down on your workbench and tightening up the screws. My workbench at uni in particular is particularly rattly, and that creates far more noise generally than whatever I'm actually doing. So that might be a factor for you, and it can be easily fixed. So there we have it. I've covered some things that may or may not be a risk to you in leatherworking. I apologise for this being such a terribly dull video, but there's really no way you can make safety interesting. I've put some further reading and all the sources that I've got information from for this video in the description box below if you want to do any further reading. And I hope you've not enjoyed it, but found it useful at least. So see you next time. Bye.